Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on this webinar about student perception surveys to improve instruction. We are excited to co-present this presentation with Sue Anderson from the Office of the State Superintendent's Office and Pete Balsma, who worked on this project diligently from the Mukilteo School District. I'm Naswe Nishida with the Center for Strengthening the Teaching Profession, and we'll go through and introduce ourselves on this webinar. We'll talk a little bit about the agenda for the next hour and then go through some slides that will show you some ways you can get into the student perception work wherever you may be. Sue, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sue Anderson. I direct the Educator Effectiveness Office at OSPI. So I oversee TPEP, the Teacher and Principal Evaluation Program, and the BEST program of support for beginning educators.
And I'm Pete Balsma. I'm the Director of Assessment and Program Evaluation in the Mukilteo School District. I've had over 30 years of experience designing surveys, among other things.
Hi, I'm Holly Hansen with Center for Strengthening the Teaching Profession, and I am Director of Teacher Engagement and Initiatives.
So for the webinar, we are going to provide you an overview about the Student Perception Project and some background about how we came into this work in Washington State. We're going to discuss the process that we use to develop these student perception items for educators to access now. And then we're going to give you kind of a how-to on where you can find and locate the student perception items that you can use with students in your classroom. We'll end with questions people may have, and we will wrap up this webinar in an hour or less. So to start, we want to give you an overview and some background about the Student Perception Project. I'm not going to read this slide word for word, but you can look and see what the purpose of this project was that started about 3 years ago with a small collection of 8 districts that are listed, who decided to endeavor with us over a 2-year period to explore what student perception data looks like, how we can collect it through surveys and other tools, and then how we can use student perception data to really think about instruction in the classroom as teachers in particular. And so really the purpose was exploratory with a general outcome of understanding how these perceptions could impact practice in the classroom. From there, and we'll talk a little bit more, we spent one more year, this last year in 2017-18, going through a process with Pete Balsma and Karen Banks on developing the actual survey items and student perception, the student perception items, which we're going to provide to you as an access point in this webinar. So why collect student perceptions? Why do we care about student perceptions? There were really 4 reasons why we initiated this work. The first one was really around growing our overall understanding of how students think about learning, teaching and learning in the classroom, how they feel they best learn, and how what kind of instruction appeals to them as receivers of knowledge in the classroom. We also wanted to use it as an opportunity to really refine and grow within a growth mindset educators' practice and instruction in the classroom. So this was really meant as an opportunity to have educators really reflect on the practice and hear from students about how they feel about the practice in the classroom. We also wanted to understand some more robust ways of collecting student perception data. We know that teachers often collect data about where students are in their classroom through exit tickets or other kinds of short opportunities for students to provide feedback on what they're learning, we wanted to look at the possibility of finding more robust, valid, and reliable systems to collect that data that could also be used to have educators reflect on that practice in perhaps more meaningful and reliable ways. And lastly, with the state evaluation law, there are two opportunities within that law that we really wanted to capitalize with student perceptions. One is that the law allows educators to use multiple measures, and student perception data could be one of those measures. And it also explicitly allowed for student input in the kind of learning that they're doing in the classroom. And so we wanted to take those two opportunities and really extend our thinking in our state around using student perception, student input in that, through that evaluation law. And the RCWs are listed at the bottom of the slide. And Sue will talk a little bit more about some of our learnings through this work. Sue.
Thanks. So I'd say the really big learning was that student perceptions are very informative to teacher practice. And I think the power of them has become more and more evident as we've engaged in this project. One of our initial assumptions was that teachers would be, concerned about this being part of their evaluation, and we wanted to make sure that there was a firewall between the student perception survey and the teacher's evaluation. But we had an early question about whether or not this data collected would be open to public records requests. And what we learned in digging into this is that pretty much everything teachers do is open to a public records request. And this might be in that same camp. In consulting with attorneys from WEA, from some human resource attorneys, and also from our own attorney at OSPI, what we learned is that actually the more connected to evaluation the student perception survey is, the more private that information will be. And this doesn't necessarily mean that a teacher would have to share the raw data with his or her evaluator, but it might mean just that there was a discussion about what the teacher learned from the student perception survey during maybe an observation conference. And so we believe that, first of all, having the student perception survey housed in eVal, while the answers are private, unless the teacher chooses to share them, the fact that they're housed in our evaluation system it shows that we believe that they're an important tool for reflection during the school year, and therefore, as a teacher is self-evaluating, that this is an important data point. The other thing is the teacher does have the option to share the data, but also what we do encourage is that evaluators a principal might ask a teacher, did you administer a student perception survey? And if so, what are some things you learned from it? And with that question, that information really becomes part of a teacher's working file for evaluation, and therefore would not be open to a public records request. Another important thing that we learned is that having the student surveys linked to the instructional frameworks is quite useful. Teachers learn important things about their practice from their students. They learn about things that are going really well, and then they learn about things that are challenging. And it's helpful to be able to go back to some of the things that seem to be more challenging, be able to look at the instructional framework and think about, okay, so it looks like my practice might be at this level. What would it take to move it up? How might I bump it up to the next level? And so the other thing is, I think having the language that kids see be the same language that teachers are using to talk about what's going on in the classroom and practice can be really Teachers really want to have control over the kinds of questions that kids are being asked for good reason. There are certain things they're really interested in finding out, and sometimes just a few things, sometimes more things, and having the ability to choose a shorter or longer survey and to choose to dive into a particular area is really important to teachers. The other thing we learned is that it was kind of disappointing to primary teachers not to be able to have student perception survey questions, but these are possible. And so we see this as probably the next phase of the project, is how might we word these questions and then make the survey itself something that younger children might be able to complete. The other thing we learned, of course, is that it's pretty expensive to have a vendor survey for available to all teachers in the state. And this cost wasn't something that we currently have budget for. So that's pretty much what we learned from the survey.
Thank you, Sue. So from the 2-year project with the districts, we decided with the support of OSPI that we would start developing our own opportunity for Washington educators to use student perception data and items to seek information that would be of relevant interest to their own practice. Pete is going to talk about this last year, in the 17-18 school year, our process for developing the specific student perception survey items that you will have access to through this webinar. We will make sure that you have all the links available to you. Pete, do you want to talk a little bit about the development process that we underwent for this work, the second part of this work?
Sure. So the first thing we did was get some experts in the field for each of the frameworks to come together to help guide our work. And that's that second point on that particular slide. If you can move to the next slide. There we go. So the first thing we needed to do was figure out which parts of the framework were actually things that students could observe and give valid feedback on. Clearly, some of the framework concepts deal with professional development or student growth goals, and those aren't things that a student would be able to give a rating on. So we kind of took out a lot of the framework's concepts that kids could not give feedback on. Once we did that, we took a look at the items that were in existing surveys. There are a number of surveys that are either online, free of charge, or in the public domain. And we looked at each item to see if it was aligned with a particular concept in one of the frameworks. Once we did that, we looked at the frameworks that we wanted to evaluate or have students provide feedback on. And in some cases, there weren't very many items or sometimes even no items related to a particular concept. So we actually had to create new items that would fill in those gaps. We also went through each of the items that were in the public domain, and sometimes they were very long and complicated, and they used sophisticated terms or maybe jargon for educators. And so we went through a fairly long process to simplify those, to clarify existing items. And when we were done, we had 359 particular items. Sell had 111, Danielson had 91, and Marzano had 157. And there was some overlap on those. So one item might fit into multiple frameworks. We also had to decide how we wanted to structure the survey. Some of these items were phrased as questions. Some of them had different kind of scales, like yes or no, or I agree or don't agree, etc. So what we ended up deciding was that we would make statements. We would list the survey items as statements, and there would be a 5-point Likert scale, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide. So once we had all those items, we drafted some pre-tests that we ran through with some small groups. It's called cognitive labs, where students take the survey and they talk out loud so that we can understand their thinking. So they might say, oh yeah, this is a really easy one. And we would time them to see how long it would take. And sometimes they would have an inquisitive look on their face, and we would take notes on that. And after they were finished, we would go back to items that seemed to be problematic or seemed to take a long time, and we would have them talk about what was going through their mind. And in that process, we did this with probably 5 or 6 different people for each framework, both elementary and secondary. And it was a nice cross section of kids. Some kids were ELLs or special ed, all races. So it was a nice cross section. And through that process, we identified items or words that were problematic. They sometimes said, I just answered this question. It seemed like it was just the same idea. So we took out some redundancy, simplified the terms, and came up with an updated, shorter survey that we could then roll out on a larger scale. At the bottom of the slide, there's an example of one of the survey items. I know what high quality work looks like. This is getting at the concept of a rubric, but some of the kids didn't know the word rubric. Also, this particular item falls into both the CEL survey and the Danielson. The range is a strongly disagree to a strongly agree, so it's a 5-point scale. So here are the survey content areas. So Danielson has 2 domains and subdomains, a total of 67 items across 2 domains. You can see each of those have 5 subdomains, and the number in the column is the number of items in the survey that fall into that particular subdomain. For CEL, there were 73 items across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dimensions, and you can see the number of items for each of those. And in the last slide, we look at Marzano. Marzano had the most items. There are 82 across 5 different components. But again, these are if you took the whole survey. You don't have to take the whole survey. You may just want to zero in on a few items for a particular component or subcomponent. It's really up to you, and we've designed it that way that you can kind of design your own survey.
So we wanted to show you some examples of the items that Pete just went over. These are just a cross-section of items from Dimension A1 on student self-assessment for the CEL 5D framework. And you can see, again, those are items that a teacher could specifically narrow in on, that they want to understand their student's perception around specific questions under that particular dimension. These are some example items from the Danielson framework. This is domain 3B, using questioning and discussion techniques. And again, this is just a cross-section of items under that particular domain that a teacher could choose to select and survey their students on. And lastly, the Marzano. This is example items from Marzano, component 3.1 on scaffolding of information. Again, teachers could go in and select the specific items they want their students to respond to. And as Pete said, a teacher does not have to select everything. And in fact, we would probably recommend teachers narrow in with some very specific things they might want to know from their students or get feedback on, and narrow in. You could do, as few as a 3 to 5 item survey, up to maybe a 10 or 15 item survey. You would probably not want to take all of the Marzano 82 items and do one survey. It would be quite a bit of time. So just thinking about your opportunities as a teacher to go in and really narrow in on something will be an important thing for you to think about. As a part of the pilot that we did in the spring, so we took this process and we had teachers volunteer in the spring of 2018 to actually utilize these survey items in their classrooms. So you can see the breakdown of student responses. And Holly, if you could kind of go over that with us, that would be great.
Sure. one of the interesting things was in this pilot, we had classroom teachers administer the surveys to their students. We had librarians, we had teams of teachers. So it was a kind of ran the gamut of people that worked directly with students. So as you can see, secondary, it was pretty high numbers with secondary students. And we got quite a few responses across the board. These were pilots. Teachers volunteered to be a part of this pilot, and they were from across the state, rural schools, urban schools, a wide variety of demographics. So we tried to hit as many of the points that we could. Okay. So we also asked, the teachers administered the survey to their students, and we provided them with the results after they completed a teacher feedback survey to let us know what they thought, how they used the results, what did the students think. We got a great deal of positive feedback from teachers. They really used the information and had conversations with their students to talk about what was coming up for them. And that's really the power that came out of all of the pilot, was the power of having conversations with their students and really digging in and saying, what does this mean? And taking a risk and really reflecting on that for their own growth in their practice. So one of the things that we also want to point out is that you get the results, but there's so many other additional opportunities. And it's not just you reflecting on your own with the data or the results, but it's really the conversations that follow up the data. So whether it's having the discussion with your evaluator, bringing some of the questions that have come up for you to your PLC, grade level teams or departments. We had departments take the pilot, and they brought their results together and had really powerful conversations about what they can do as a team, a grade level team or department team. Also, opportunities to work with a coach or a mentor around the discussions of what surfaced. But really the most important discussions that we heard from teachers across the board were those discussions with their students and taking the time to follow up and have those discussions.
Sue, do you want to add any reflections around this piece in particular?
Well, I think it is really, getting the results is one thing, but what you do with the results is really the most important thing. I think discussions with students, really tying results back to the framework and looking at that. This work can help to determine professional growth goals, professional growth plans. I guess another thing we've talked about in our office is the thinking that it might be challenging for a first or second year teacher to do the student perception survey unless they were really supported by a mentor in taking it. Because I think in the first couple of years of practice, I think it's harder to know exactly what to do with the data. Now that I've learned this, what do I do next? And, students are very honest about things, which is why we love them. And I think sometimes, they're not trying to be hurtful. They're just expressing how things feel for them. And I think it's important to pay attention to that, but it's important to put it in a larger context and understand, what some of the reasons might be. And I think that a mentor could help a newer teacher do this, but without that support, we'd probably encourage people waiting until maybe year 3 before they do a student perception survey.
Holly, do you want to talk about some questions people might think about as they're looking at their data?
Sure. So when you initially receive the data, you have a lot of information laid out in front of you. So really stepping back and doing your own self-reflection. And these are some of the questions that we encourage people to reflect upon as part of the pilot, of really sitting down and thinking about what do you notice? What jumps out at you? Is there something that's surprising? Is there something that you were like, yeah, I thought so? And then thinking about, okay, so here it is. So what questions? Where do I go with this? And really, these are questions that are fairly simple that you can use for your own self-reflection, or as a group to really talk about, but taking the time to reflect upon these. We heard from people that use these as kind of they journaled before they took it to other people to talk about, or this was something they said, I really want to think through this with a partner, with a coach, with my PLC, what have you.
There is a student perception video that has both educators that were involved in the student perception project, as well as some students that also had the opportunity to take surveys and talk with their teachers about the perceptions of their class and their classmates as a whole. It's about a 6-minute video, and we will make it available to you. We won't show it on this webinar, but we encourage you to go and look at the video and hear directly from people in the project about the work that they did and the power that it has for teaching and learning. So we're moving to the last part of this webinar, where we're going to talk about kind of step 3, where we are at now. We've gone through the background of how we got into this work with the project. We talked about kind of phase 2, where we worked with Pete and Karen to really develop items for Washington State. And now we are in phase 3, where we actually have access to the specific student perception items on eVal, which is the Washington State's evaluation management system. Not all districts utilize eVal for their evaluation work in their districts, but all educators can have access into eVal, and that is where the big survey items for student perception lives. We want to talk a little bit, if you are somebody who does not know eVal or does not have access to eVal, we want to provide you with some direction around how you might get access, actually how you would get access to these items without necessarily being a district that uses eVal all the time. And Pete, you are one of your district's data security managers. Can you talk people through a little bit of how they might go about getting access?
Sure. So everybody who has a certificate has an account in EDS. I'm not sure what that stands for, but it's some database down at OSPI where you go in and your certification is there and your address. Chances are, if you've never logged on, you probably have no permissions granted to you and you haven't used it. But if you need to access eVal, you'll need to go online to the EDS spot. You can go in and request a password or a username and put in your email, and you can be forwarded some information where you can then log on. You need to make sure that your EDS supervisor in your district adds eVal as one of your applications. So you can go to this particular link. That assumes you can get into EDS. to see who these people are. I'm the person, there's 2 or 3 in each district. If you don't know, just call your technology office and they can tell you who it is. Send them an email and say, I want to have eVal. Just something simple like that, and they will take it from there and sign you up. You'll get an email if that you've been an application has been added, or you have a new password, or there's something will be there to prompt you. Once you go in, you click on My Applications, which is at the top of this this menu where it says View My Applications. eVal is one of them. It might be your only one. You click on that, it takes you to eVal, and you're good to go. It takes a day for your application to kind of become live. So once you contact your EDS manager in your district and request eVal to be put on, assuming they do it right away, you'll be able to get to eVal the next day.
And Pete, is it true that a teacher also needs their principal to?
I think that's right. That's right.
Okay.
So there's teachers or principals for each building need to be assigned to you. And so if you're having problems and can't log on, contact your EDS person again. And they'll figure out, oh, it's because the teacher hasn't been assigned, and they can assign it, or your principal can assign it. There are some schools who don't use eVal at all, and so your principal might not know about this. So the EDS person would need to sign up the principal. That takes a day, and then the principal or the EDS person can go ahead and just assign you the principal, and then you can see your data.
And just because as a teacher you're assigned to a principal does not mean that the principal has access to all of your information that
Right.
that you are seeing on EDS. Is that correct? It's more of a formality of the system.
Yeah, there are certain parts of eVal which are meant to be seen by each other as teachers and principals write up their observations and that kind of thing. But there are other parts that are certainly private behind a firewall. I don't even know how it works. I do want to say a couple things about just once you get in and see the items. Keep in mind that you probably don't want to have too many items. 4 or 5 items is probably enough for any particular construct to give you enough information. And if you're on a focused evaluation, that's probably all you need. If you're doing a comprehensive, you may want to do survey items from each of the dimensions that you're being rated on. Keep in mind that you need 4 or 5. Some of them have 10 items. You don't need that many. Also keep in mind that the reading level for these are about 4th or 5th grade level, so it shouldn't be any problem for a secondary teacher. The elementary school teachers, what we found when we did the survey was that even ELL kids could read the pretty simple statements and understand it at grades 4 and 5. And it's okay if a student doesn't understand something, that you can come along and maybe paraphrase it or clarify it as they're taking the survey.
Thanks, Pete. So this is when you get into eVal, this is where this is a guide to help you find the student perception items and also create surveys, open them, allow students to access the surveys, and then look at your results. This is all an electronic system. So unless you want to print out items, which you are welcome to do on your own, all of this is built into the eVal system as an electronic online system whereby students access survey items through a link that is generated by you to them, probably via email, or you could probably write a link on the board. But students will need to have access to some kind of device in order to take the survey items. So this is the eVal help page, And under that, you'll see a whole host of access points to different things in the eVal system. Under the module section is the perception surveys, and this will get you to this main page on how to create surveys. So we are going to go into creating surveys. And we're just going to walk you through this at a very general level, and we encourage you to go in. It's a real good play-by-play how-to guide on how to create a survey with guided visuals on what you will see in terms of screenshots as you go through the process. So you will create a perception survey by going into. It will come up as a user. You will come up as a user with perception surveys listed at the bottom, and you will then step 3, add a survey. And this is where you will be creating a unique survey that is just for you to name, for you to select survey items based on instructional framework items that have alreody been developed and selected for you. So already curated, you're going to go in and, as Pete said, narrow in on specific areas you want to know from your students on specific things. You will click through these statements, and you probably can't see the screen that well, but in this particular example, it's dimension or domain to classroom environment, and a teacher could go in and click the specific items they want students to respond to. Click, click, click. I'm moving through this very quickly. You're then going to preview your survey. So again, you can select as many or as few items that you want to show up in your online survey to students. You want to look it over, and then you're going to edit and launch your survey. When you do this, you are going to be provided a unique URL that is just for you, connected to you and your user, your eVal username, and is one that you can copy and paste into an email or write on the board, or however you share that with students to take the survey using a device. So that will be unique to you. It will not be shared with anybody beyond you. And again, as Sue mentioned earlier, you get to determine what you want to share with your evaluator if you want to do that. And as Holly mentioned, how are you going to have those conversations after the survey? All of that is going to be up to you as the teacher to determine.
Also,
yes.
the frequency. If people want to administer this several times a year, the same one to keep collecting, that's fine. It's really up to the teacher.
Yes, so you are welcome to use this as certain check-in points during the year on specific items you're really seeking to get feedback from your students. And I think that's, again, a great way to kind of gauge progress with your class about things that you are intentionally working on. So you're going to leave your survey open, and we would highly suggest, based off the pilot and working with teachers in the process, that you really tighten up the timeline in which you're going to allow that survey to be open. If you can allow some time within the class structure of the day to allow students to go into that survey item and then you close it, you probably will have a better response rate, and B, you won't allow this survey link to be open for an indeterminate amount of time. You're going to want to close it, give students time to respond so that you can then get your feedback relatively quickly. So we want to show you, what do students see? What does this look like on their end? So this is a secondary survey. This is what students would see. It's a list of questions and then the 5-point Likert scale that Pete mentioned, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. These are not open-ended questions. These are very very much along specific 5 points in which students can respond. So students are going to click through these survey items and then answer a few questions, a few additional questions on race and ethnicity and gender, and then they are going to submit. Once they submit, that information goes directly to the teacher. And this is what the teacher will see. A report will be generated to the teacher. So again, the teacher will need to close the survey in order to generate that report. This is what they will see. It's a very nice, clear, and concise report. The questions will be listed, and then color-coded are the responses that students provided. So you can see in this case, on the first question, there's a longer blue line here. So that would determine that of the students, the majority of them responded with that blue response, which is strongly disagree. In some of these other ones where red is a predominant color, students disagreed. Orange is neither, green is agree, dark blue is strongly agree. So this just gives an opportunity for teachers to look at the number of responses and where students, kind of a visual for where students responded to that information. This again is going to be information that a teacher is going to take in, and we really, as Holly mentioned, want to encourage teachers to self-reflect on this, but also move to the what next. Mm-hmm. What am I going to do differently? What might I try differently in my practice to move to more green and dark blue boxes? What are some things I might have? What are some conversation points I might have with colleagues around different strategies I might use with students? That is where this data. That's where we want this data to move teachers. The what next part. The data is great, but we really are talking about the action, the conversation, the where do I go next, is really the importance and the power of this kind of perception data. Mm-hmm. All right, Pete, Holly, Sue, do you have anything to add on this eVal piece in particular?
I would just say that the survey goes pretty quickly. When we gave the surveys that had 60, 70, 80 items, kids were finished in about 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. So this can go really, really fast. Probably logging in will be the most time-consuming thing, especially if you're only going to pick one or two dimensions. Mm-hmm. You might want to think about picking more dimensions if you're on a focus, more than just your area of focus, because the kids actually will be very honest, and you'll get really good feedback, and it won't take very long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Kids are pretty quick. I also think the other thing we found out going through this process was they're not out to get the teacher. Yeah. This is not a rate my teacher situation. There is not an open-ended response, and I'm gonna get you for something you did to me kind of opportunity. This is really formatted in a way that's structured around the teaching and learning in the classroom. And I would also say there are a lot of students that are interested in, especially if they've never had this kind of opportunity. Yeah. Why teacher X why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. So I think anytime you can preload the reason you as a teacher are interested in what they think, sometimes that opens up a real opportunity that they have never experienced in their education. And what we found with some elementary students is they were quite worried about how this information would be used. So in some ways got very protective of their teacher, which was very sweet. But I think it's also an opportunity for the relationship between teachers and students to really strengthen, because this is something that the teacher is interested in doing. This is opening the door to conversations around student need in the classroom, how students best feel that they learn, the kind of environment that the classroom brings to that. So those kinds of opportunities to fill in that information ahead of the survey are also going to reap, I think, a good benefit in terms of students taking this survey and understanding how this information could be used.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Holly, do you have something?
So the other little piece of that too is I heard from a couple people when they told the students we're going to discuss this later, it really opened that this was about growing and this was about all of us as a classroom too. And so I think being straightforward with them of we're going to have some conversations about this, and this is how I get to be a better teacher, can help some of those kids that are defensive and, oh my gosh, what's this going to do? Who's going to come after my teacher? So
I think it's also important for teachers to not be defensive once they see the results and maybe discuss it with their students. Be in a listening mode, be in a learning mode, and just take it in, and that attitude, that stance will solicit honest feedback, and then you can cry later.
It's not that bad, Pete.
No, it's not. But you could have 25 items, and 24 you get great ratings, and the one you might not like it, and it's hard on us. I mean, I'll admit, I always remember the things that I didn't do so well on, not the things I did well on. So, take it all with, a big picture in mind, knowing that, sometimes when kids get, they don't get 100% on their tests, they could get broken up because they missed one or two. Well, we're kind of the same way.
So this is the link that we will send to you that gets you into kind of the step-by-step how-to of accessing the items in eVal that we just showed you. But again, you're going to want to connect with your EDS data manager person in your district to ensure that you've got a setup to get into EDS. And if you already have that set up, you should be able to see the perception items on the left-hand screen when you log in. I don't think that we have any questions from our crowd tonight. So we are going to end this webinar with any final thoughts from the panel. Sue, would you like to start us off? Any final thoughts?
Sure. I would just like to encourage people to experience this. I know that I know there are a lot of teachers who, before the advent of this particular project, have been asking their students about how things are going in the classroom. And I'm excited that we have this tool that has been tested and that connects to our instructional frameworks that will allow teachers to do that. They'll be able to do it pretty quickly, pretty easily in a format that kids are used to. And I think there's some great things to learn out there. And I think that it's important, and Pete, you mentioned this earlier, it's important to celebrate the things that are going well and make sure that you honor those parts of your practice that are really making a positive impact on students.
Thanks, Sue. Pete, do you have any final thoughts?
No, just give it a try. I think you'll be surprised at how useful it is, and the feedback that you get will make you a better teacher.
Thanks, Pete. Holly?
I think everyone said it. It's a great tool, and kids benefit. We benefit as educators in our practice, and it's risky, but as we've heard from some of the feedback from people, it can be one of the most powerful tools. for growing students' practice.
And that's my child screaming in the background. One final thought around all of this is we did hear from teachers that while their evaluation process with their evaluator is an important part of their professional practice and their professional growth, they have found that student perceptions, because they're with those students on a daily, regular basis, they found that kind of feedback was as or more important to them in some cases around particular pieces of their practice. So again, I think this is just an opportunity, and like Pete said, opening ourselves up to another data point to understand where we're at with our own professional practice and the impact that we have on students. We want to thank you for listening to this webinar, and that we hope that you will think and consider about trying this out. And I think if you have any problems or any questions about this work, please feel free to contact any of us. We're happy to help you as you endeavor forward. Thank you for staying tuned. Have a good
Thanks, everyone.
student day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.